I'm Sarah Dockery-Sparks, Assistant Editor and Data Journalist for Education Week. I have covered education research and the science of learning for about 20 years. Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by Jill Barchet, Bella DeMarco, and Matthew Kraft. Jill writes for the weekly Proof Points column for the Hechinger Report. In 2019, she received an American Educational Research Association Award for excellence in media reporting on education research. Previously, she was a Spencer Fellow and a former algebra teacher. Bella DeMarco is a policy analyst for Future Ed. She's previously worked for expanding access to after-school and summer learning programs for underserved youth, while on after-school alliances research and field outreach programs. Bella is currently pursuing her master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. And finally, Matthew Kraft is an associate professor of education and economics at Brown University and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research primarily focuses on efforts to improve educator and organizational effectiveness in urban public schools. Prior to getting his doctorate in quantitative policy analysis and education from Harvard University, he taught middle and high school humanities in California. So today we're going to be looking at response to pandemic era missed learning. Is it more important to provide more or longer educational opportunities? When it comes to instruction time, does quantity win over quality? Is there a tipping point for instructional learning time? Across the nation, we're seeing a lot of educators and education leaders experiment with all different kinds of models for expanded learning time to help students recover from unprecedented disruptive learning during the pandemic. This can look like many different things in many different districts. Some are expanding the academic calendar, reimagining the structure and the length of the school day or the school week. Some offer supplemental or accelerated instruction time during the school day or in extracurricular activities. Regardless of the format, one thing remains the same. It can take the place of traditional out-of-school time like summer camp, after-school enrichment. But today, we will look at the various approaches to expanded learning time. Our expert panelists will cover whether there's a specific magic number of minutes or hours in a school day that can really make a difference, or an optimal length for the academic calendar. We'll explore what's gained and lost when education leaders use traditionally out-of-school time to keep kids in school, either for instructional or other purposes. We'll start today with Matthew Kraft. Can you tell us a little bit about the prevailing narrative right now about instructional time in American schools and how that relates to student achievement? And what does the research say as we move forward?
Thanks, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be with you and these distinguished panelists. I want to just ground the conversation in what I think will likely be another familiar debate, which is thinking about the role of money in school. That's something that we've debated for decades. And I think we've learned through a range of rigorous research that money matters. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for improving educational outcomes. And we get caught up in the debate of, does it matter or not, or it matters how you use it, not how much you have. But I think two things can be true. Money matters and how you use it matters. And the same goes for time. And that's a conclusion that I've arrived at after reviewing over 75 different research studies that use causal research methods to credibly identify the effect of learning time on student achievement in a working paper with my co-author, Sarah Novikov, called Time in School. And, I think what's key is that not only do we find, on average, a positive effect of time on learning, but that average really masks wide variation depending on when the time is allocated, how the time is used, And what was the amount of time that already existed in the school setting? And so I think in addition to that general orientation of the evidence, it's just good to have a handful of comparative facts. Internationally, we talk a lot about kind of the US falling behind our peers. And when you look at the data on international comparisons of instructional time, the US actually ranks fairly high, eighth compared to between kind of 40 and 50 countries that have data through the OECD. And one of the patterns you see is that compared to most other high income countries, we have longer school days on average within the public school system, but shorter school years in comparison. And we can talk about that average in the United States, but we also know that the US education system is highly decentralized. And so that average actually masks what I think is, if there is one takeaway that I would love to impart in this conversation, is that there are huge inequities in access to learning time within the United States. On average, students in the US are in school about 1,230 hours per year. That's about 6.9 hours per day, 178 days per year. But if you compare just traditional public schools in the United States and rank them in terms of total time in the academic school year, those schools at the 90th percentile out of 100 are in school for 200 or more hours per year than those at the 10th percentile. That's essentially saying they have a school year that is about 5.5 weeks longer in terms of effective time. You multiply that by 12 or 13 years, and you're getting substantial amounts of inequity in access to learning. And so when we have these conversations, I think it's really important to recognize that time matters, but we need to use it well. There's likely diminishing returns. So if you have a super long school day, adding a little bit more time probably doesn't get you as much as adding an extra day to the calendar if it's a short calendar year. And that there's wide inequities in the US where some kids really are being left behind, even though on average, the United States is not lagging our high income peers nearly as much as some of the kind of broader rhetoric might suggest.
We know that Dr. Kraft is going to be offline briefly, but he will be back with us in a few minutes for the Q&A. Let's go for right now to Jill Barchet at the Hechinger Report. I know you have been covering a lot of great research coming out this year about not just what academic recovery looks like, but what individual students' learning rates are like. And it seems there's some interesting misconceptions about how fast kids actually learn new material. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what it might take to catch up?
Hi, I want to clarify. Should I start with how far behind students have slipped, or you want me to start with that learning rate study, Sarah?
Why don't we start with what we know about how much the learning trajectory has slipped since the pandemic,
Sure.
and then go into the rates that students are having in getting back.
Great. So by chance, I was just at an embargoed briefing by the National Center for Education Statistics. That's the geeky data unit inside the Department of Education. And we have a little bit of an update that's going to come out Thursday, but I'm not allowed to share it yet. But I can share with you some the data we knew up until this week. And one thing we know is that before the pandemic, principals said that 36% of their students were behind grade level. So we're used to over a third of students being behind grade level. But then after the pandemic hit, 50% of students, according to principals, were behind grade level in their school. That was in, they said that in June 2021. And then at the end of last year, in December 2022, that only improved a tiny bit. They said 49% of their students were still behind grade level. And now we have a new update for 2023, which we can all learn about on Thursday. And if you want to find out about it early, you can call the Department of Education's press department. Well, I've been tracking learning loss figures ever since the pandemic came. I feel like a meteorologist about like how far behind students are. And I want to share my most recent story with you because there's a few good graphs in it that kind of give you a perspective. You know, some research studies say, oh, students are 4 to 5 months behind, and others say they're 1 to 3 months behind. And I wouldn't get bogged down in all the details, but a graph like this helps to put things in perspective. This is the percent of children that are on grade level according to one of the benchmark assessment tests. It's this one is by Curriculum Associates. And as you can see, let me just move that up a little bit bigger. Back before the pandemic is the navy blue line, and you can see over 80% of kindergartners were on grade level before the pandemic. And then look how after the pandemic hit, that slipped to below 70%. And that purple one is just this past spring, so we're just not really improving. And as you get as the kids get older, there are fewer and fewer that are on grade level. But as you can see, there's kind of a similar drop to how many are on grade level now, and it's just not improving that much. It's not getting better. When you get all the way to 8th graders on the far right here, only 43% were on grade level before the pandemic hit, and now it's hovering around 38%. So no improvement really. Now I'm gonna switch to another. This one, I'm gonna make it a little bit smaller so you can see it better. See if that works. One more less. There we go. This one's another easier, almost easier to absorb. This is looking at another assessment. This is the Renaissance learning. And you can see the difference in achievement between the most recent spring of 2023 and 2019 before the pandemic. And this really shows how we declined a little bit in the early grades in reading, but look at those 8th graders on the far right. They're so much farther behind. That what that's saying is the typical 8th grader in the spring of 2023 is so much farther behind than the typical 8th grader in the spring of 2019. Now, I don't know if you can see the points on the left-hand side. It goes to 2, 4, 6, 8, 12. Look at the in math, these are much greater scale. And beginning in 5th grade onwards, students are more than 10 points behind. That's a lot. That's months of learning, and and they're just not catching up. Then they give you 1/3 look here. Make that a little bigger. This might be the easiest of all the charts to understand. This is NWEA, which was recently purchased by a for-profit company. And this is showing on the left how far behind students are compared to pre-COVID levels. But what I really like is this green line, and it's saying how many months of schooling would be necessary for them to catch up. And so you can see here, for 8th graders, it's 7.5 months of schooling. That's like almost an entire school year, like extra. They would need 7.5 months extra in reading to catch up to where 8th graders were before the pandemic hit. And look at it in math. It's just even more astronomical. It's 9.1. That's more than a year of school. So I feel like this is a great way of seeing that students really did learn a lot, lose a lot during the pandemic. There hasn't been a lot of catch up. And where we do see some catch up, particularly in some of the middle grades, What's quite interesting is that the researchers don't see that students are learning faster. They're not learning more in a year now than they used to before the pandemic to do this catch up. What they're noticing is that there's a little bit less learning loss during the summertime. And it's a real mystery. People don't understand yet why, since the pandemic hit, students are retaining more of their knowledge. They're not forgetting as much. And so that's my meteorological report for today.
Thanks. And we'll go into a little bit more about what you're learning about student learning rates during the Q&A. I want to turn to Bella DeMarco. We know that a lot of school districts are experimenting a lot with different models for extended learning time, but we also know that less than half of states have high poverty schools that are really getting a lot more money than their median poverty schools. And we also know that a lot of states are relying on federal recovery money from the pandemic, which is going to be expiring next year. So I'd like to know a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of state and district approaches to expanded learning time, as well as which ones seem most sustainable and effective in the long term.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, over the last couple of years, one of the things that we've been doing at Future Ed has been tracking and looking at school districts' responses to the pandemic, and specifically how they've been using sort of their pandemic funds. And so when we talk about expanding learning time, there are several ways that we can do this, and we looked at some of the big ones. And so the first way is by extending the school year. And so adding additional days beyond what is mandated by states. And so typically that is 180 days, but like Matt said earlier, this does vary pretty significantly state to state. And so there's a couple of different ways that we have seen districts do this. The two primary is, the first is by extending sort of the length of the calendar. And so a school district might have their calendar go for 200 or more days. And so students would either start the school year earlier or end the school year later than the rest of their peers. And so I think one of the interesting examples that we've seen is what has happened in Richmond Public Schools. And so starting this school year, they adopted their what they're calling their RPS 200 pilot program. And so there were 2 elementary schools that adopted it starting this school year. And so the students in those 2 schools, they started their year in July. And so that way they will end this school year at the same time as everyone else in the district, which has sort of some important implications that we can talk a little bit more about later. And so this, the Richmond's RPS 200 program is also sort of a compromised initiative that, again, we can talk about some of the challenges in getting it originally passed in a bit. And then the other sort of primary model that we have seen is sort of the intersession model. And so this is where like schools or districts will add additional days sort of throughout the school year. So it could be during spring break, winter break, or other things like that. And so these sort of blocks of time, what we've seen, they could be mandatory blocks of time, they could be targeted for certain students, or they could be open to all students to receive sort of additional support. And so one interesting example for here is the Dallas Independent School District. And so in 2021, they launched a sort of district-wide expanded school year initiative. And so there were 2 sort of primary calendars that they adopted. And by and large, the most popular was their intersession model. And so there was 41 schools in Dallas that adopted this calendar. And so at these schools, they ended up adding about 5 weeks of intersession time to their school calendar, where they invited the students that they thought would benefit most from this additional support to come and participate in their intersessions. LA Unified is another example. They took sort of a similar approach, but just much less intensive. And so they added what they called acceleration days onto their sort of spring and winter breaks for students to come and get additional support. The other model that we looked at is sort of extending the school day. And so typically what we saw was this meant adding anywhere from maybe 30 minutes to an hour onto the school day, which could equal anywhere from sort of 14 to 28 days over the course of the year. And that's sort of based on a 6.5-hour day. So that will vary state to state. And so when we add this additional time, it could be sort of spread out across the entire day. And so each period gets a little bit longer. But sort of the more effective thing that we have seen is using that additional time for sort of a dedicated, targeted sort of intervention block. And so that's what we saw in Atlantic Public Schools, for example. They ended up adding 30 minutes onto their elementary school calendar. And so they used that time for sort of a dedicated intervention block for small group tutoring and things like that. We saw something similar in the Cicero School District outside of Chicago, where they also added 30 minutes onto their day, and they used that for sort of small group math and reading support as well. And then the last sort of model that we looked at is just your sort of typical out of school time opportunities. So these are your traditional after school and summer learning programs. And so what we found, probably not surprising, is that these are much more widely adopted than sort of extending the school year or extending the school day. And that's probably for a number of different reasons, but I think some of the bigger ones are probably because the after school and summer learning programs don't necessarily require sort of those broad calendar changes. You're less likely to run into sort of the scheduling challenges, the cost challenges. They're also more often than not going to be voluntary for students, and they typically tend to focus more on sort of enrichment opportunities. And so that can be sort of more appealing to students or to families, to teachers as well. But then you also run into the issue of these programs are not always necessarily, their primary focus is not always on academics. And so we have to look at that balance as well. And so just one example that we have found is in Mobile County in Alabama. So they were able to use their COVID funds to expand their after school and summer programming across all 92 of their schools. And so they were able to use this time for homework help, additional academic support, but also a focus on sort of art and music and STEM and other enrichment opportunities. And so those were just sort of some of the bigger ways that we have seen in terms of increasing academic time. And obviously they all sort of have their own pros and cons, their own challenges in terms of implementation and things like that we need to consider when we talk about sort of what are the more effective ways to increase learning time and specifically to increase that instructional time.
Thanks. Actually, I'd like to stay with you 1 minute. If you can tell us a little bit about the funding and sustainability there. You mentioned a few folks who are using their COVID relief funding for this, and I'm interested if you're seeing any differences in model of which seem to be the most sustainable for districts, and whether districts are approaching this as a short-term intervention to get kids back from the pandemic, or if they are actually changing the structure of how they're looking at schooling.
Yes, so to your second question, that definitely depends on the district. I know some districts, these are sort of temporary, others are hoping to continue. In terms of sustainability, typically the sort of after school and summer program model is a little bit more sustainable for several reasons, but one is a lot of the times that they do sort of rely on community partners to help provide this support. So there's that aspect. You also they're not always run by sort of your school day teachers. And so when we talk about, especially with lengthening the school year, a lot of the times we are talking about renegotiating teacher contracts, providing pretty hefty bonuses to teachers, which is obviously needed, but it does incur some pretty big costs. And so extending the school year is going to be typically more costly than sort of your optional after school and summer learning programs. And also when we talk about, I guess, the number of students who are participating and are we targeting these programs, or are they open to everybody? That's going to have different sort of cost implications as well.
Dr. Kraft, could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned this huge gap between the 90th percentile schools that are basically giving their kids the equivalent of more than a year, close to 2 years of additional instruction over the course of their academic career. What do we know about those schools versus the 10% schools, and what that does in terms of their student performance, as well as what approaches they might be using?
So one of the key findings of our research is that students experience these vastly different amounts of what we would like to call allocated learning time. It's just the length of time that their school is operating. And we have to recognize that schools use that learning time in very different ways. And so it is a comparison that's apples to apples to say we have X amount of time in our school day. That's not the same as we have X amount of learning time allocated to math, and so the comparisons are important to kind of dig into the weeds. But I think one of the main things that we know is that there are a number of states which are responsible in our country to set minimum learning time laws. And those can be in the form of total instructional hours. They can be in the form of minimum number of school days. They can be in the form of minimum hours per day in different combinations. And that patchwork kind of laws means that there's a number of states that have very, very low minimum number of total hours. And there are schools in those states that often go well above those minimum hours. They're not binding, but there's a non-trivial number of schools that only meet those. So I think the first of the puzzle here is recognizing that those differences, not to that extreme degree, but to a meaningful degree, more than 100 hours difference on average, even at the level policy. And if I were to kind of a very potentially actionable lever for at least bringing up that lower tail, the schools with the least amount of total time, it would be by leveraging state laws to increase that. Now, interestingly, we don't see a strong relationship in kind of cutting along race and socioeconomic status in terms of this inequity that we often do for other elements of inequity in our educational schools system, because it's more often that larger urban districts have longer school time. And so those schools are more often serving larger proportions of students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And we see this kind of non-linear relationship, a relationship where we've got a lot of low-income and students of color getting large amounts of time, and then it kind of bottoms out, and then a non-trivial amount also getting very little learning time. And so I think there's a lot to unpack here, because there are very mixed opinions among communities and parents about whether or not we should be increasing learning time, and if so, how. In terms of pinning down the effect on student achievement, that's really where we have to turn to the rigorous causal evidence that uses credible research designs. And what we see is that these are differences that amount to between a, let's call it, month of learning to several months of learning in the kind of higher end of the spectrum, but that again the challenge is that what we've learned from prior studies doesn't always mean that a new district comes along and says, I'm going to do that, and they're going to experience the exact same result, because implementation matters equally as much as the inline, how much time is potentially increased.
And I know your research showed anywhere from 16% to 25% of a school day was not necessarily the instructional time. I'm wondering, are there other valuable things in that time that we should keep that non-instructional time? Or is this really a question of efficiency in how quickly schools are able to get on task and stay on task?
So anytime we're using a scarce resource, whether it be money or time, we should ask, how can we use it most efficiently? And I think that's particularly important for time, because what kids do outside of school is also meaningful for their learning and for their lives and for their, well-being. So we should think carefully before taking that time away and adding it to the school day. My colleagues and I were interested in a better understanding the degree to which we were losing learning time that already exists during the school day. And we explored that question by partnering with the Providence Public Schools to conduct over 60 classroom observations just to observe what was happening inside of classrooms. And this statistic you cited, between 15 to 25% of instructional time being lost, is net of the things that we want schools to do that aren't traditional instructional time, like lunch and recess and passing periods. It's just of the time that they're in core classes. We found that probably a lower estimate is up to about 25%, because of things like in this district, which I don't think is representative of all districts, but I think it's helpful and emblematic of what we're seeing in a lot of urban districts, particularly with the increase in chronic absenteeism post-COVID, that things like students showing up late and disrupting the classroom, disorienting the kind of flow of instruction, in particular classroom phone calls that someone from the central office is calling to ask about a student or check in about permission slips, intercom announcements, the drive-bys with teachers and administrators knocking on a door. Those little things add up to a degree that we don't really perceive because they're so small, but they're so frequent. And what was particularly compelling is it wasn't just the time that was lost due to the interruption. It's that it snowballs into a 5 to 10x larger amount of time lost, because getting students back on track once you lose that kind of
Dr. Kraft, I think your signal is going out a little bit.
Is real, into policy around learning time requirements and getting. I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
My apologies. Just to wrap up, I think that we can really make a difference by increasing minimum learning time hours, but also using the time that we have well. And that means holding classroom instructional time sacred from these frequent daily interruptions.
Thanks. Jill, I know we've heard a lot about acceleration. And one of the underlying things with that is increasing the rate at which students can learn. And there's a lot of conversation around some kids being faster learners or slower learners. Your recent coverage of the Carnegie Mellon research really kind of adds some questions and doubt to whether there really are those kind of difference or if they operate in that way. Could you talk a little bit about what you saw through that research as well as what you've seen in the classroom?
This was a fascinating little study. When I was writing about it, I wasn't thinking about pandemic learning loss at all, I didn't even think about the possible connections to it. This is a lab of cognitive scientists at Carnegie Mellon, and they wanted to study what faster learners were doing, just to kind of see what their brains were doing and how they were what these students were thinking, so that we could share this wisdom with the rest of us. So they looked at some data sets of students on instructional software and educational computer games, and they were looking to isolate the faster learners so they could study them. And then they ran into this huge problem because they couldn't find any faster learners. And they were shocked, because it goes against what all of us think. I mean, we've all been in classrooms where some kids get A's and they seem to learn everything instantly fast, and the rest of us take a long time and a lot more repetition. And they were confused. They thought, well, maybe it's a mistake. And they kept looking at it across all of their data sets of students on education technology, and across all 27 data sets, they couldn't see any evidence that some kids were learning faster than others. And the way Ken Codinger, the head of this research project, explained it to me is that kids are starting in different places and they're ending in different places, but they're all progressing at the same rate. I think it's important to understand that they were not measuring how much kids learn per minute or per hour. They were measuring how much kids learn per practice opportunity. So imagining like how much you learn from a practice math problem, or how much you learn every time you play this battleship fraction game and you're trying to guess where the fraction lands on the number line. It's sort of like each swing at the bat. Think of it that way. And that what they're noticing is that for every swing at the bat, kids learn almost about the same amount. So if you knew nothing about a topic, it would take every kid, the high achievers and the low achievers, about the same amount of time to master it. And the reason it seems in the classroom that some kids are learning much faster than others is because they actually have a head start. And the way Professor Koeniger explained it to me is, maybe some kids learn fractions much faster in third grade, but maybe they've been making pancakes with their dad every Sunday morning and using measuring cups, and they already had a lot more exposure to it. So it's kind of mind-blowing, and it may only be true for computerized instruction, where kids are really getting guidance and being forced to kind of keep swinging at the bat. And they also get instant feedback, where they're told if they get the problem right or wrong, and they might be getting some hints. And if they get it wrong on some of it, the computer explains how to do the problem properly. In the real life and real classroom, where there's not this guided practice work, it's quite clear that kids have different motivations, and some are self-motivated to swing at the bat more, and they'll do more practice problems. And when they're confused, they'll ask questions and get guidance, and all that helps you learn a lot more.
And just to note, this was not including students with disabilities, correct?
Correct. They didn't. There might have been kids with disabilities in the data set, but they weren't demarcated. And so it was just all the students and most of it was on math. A lot of it was on math learning software. They did notice a slightly more difference in learning rates when it came to language. Particularly ones that just involve pure memorization. So for example, there was a program that was teaching Chinese vocabulary. And I guess you just had to memorize the Chinese characters. And there are some more differences in how quickly and how many repetitions you need to memorize something. But in other kinds of learning, where you can also rely on deduction, induction, pattern recognition, and you can compensate with other skills, kids learn at remarkably similar rates.
Thanks. Bella, you've had a lot of interaction with after school and before school programs. And it's been really interesting watching some of the research around the effectiveness of different programs that are outside of the normal school day. There's also been some really interesting findings around the use of tutoring, which seems to be more effective when it's done within the school day than after school. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what trends we're seeing in how districts are using that out of school time and what approaches seem to be most effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the out of school time space and after school programs in general, typically they've primarily had more of a focus on sort of the enrichment opportunities. We are seeing a lot of programs that also have sort of a primary focus on academics as well. And so when we talk about addressing learning loss, those are typically the ones that we see be a little bit more effective in terms of boosting academic outcomes. That said, we do know that there's sort of this important research that shows that the sort of the social emotional type stuff is heavily correlated with academic outcomes as well. And so sort of the after school space and focusing on sort of the whole of child approach, we are seeing research come out that shows that that is effective. And then in terms of sort of tutoring, what we are seeing is that the in-school day tutoring does tend to be more effective. And I think one of the sort of reasons for that we have seen is sort of the connection between what's being taught in the school day and what they're receiving that tutoring in. And so that high dosage tutoring needs to be connected to that core curriculum. It's beneficial if it's taught by the teacher or if it's taught by sort of a highly effective teacher. And so we've seen that that's where, and that's why some of that in-school day tutoring is more effective. But we're also seeing a lot of tutoring happen in the out-of-school space as well that is having a positive impact.
Dr. Kraft, could you comment a little bit on some districts are moving the total opposite way of moving to 4-day weeks. And some of those are increasing the length of days, but not necessarily increasing the overall amount of time. What are you finding about that particular structure and how it affects student learning?
I think that it's understandable schools are trying to find ways to address two big challenges. One is tight budgets, and that was a motivation for a lot of changes to 4-day school weeks kind of pre-pandemic, which was, not insignificant. And then post-pandemic, a lot of the transition has been, particularly among rural schools that have struggled, and they see offering a 4-day school week as a way to compete in a tight labor market. The evidence, which there's been really a flurry of high quality studies that have come out in the last couple of years, I think overwhelmingly shows that this is a bad deal for students. Now, that doesn't mean that that is always the case. Of course, these estimates are averages. And I think one of the key things that shapes some of that evidence is whether or not schools are keeping the total amount of instructional time the same and just kind of chopping up Friday and adding it in equal parts to Monday to Thursday, or they're reducing the total amount of time in that shift to the 4-day school week. But I think that the key thing to remember is that all time is not created equal. So an hour of learning on a Friday between 9 and 10 a.m. is not the same as an hour of learning on a Thursday from 3:30 to 4:30. And so you can imagine there's diminishing returns to kids and teachers' ability to stay focused over the course of, to ask ourselves, it's understandable to make that transition given the challenges, but that shouldn't be the only option for schools and districts as a potential solution to difficult budget situations and financial shortfalls, as well as a tight teacher labor market. We have to be able to find solutions that don't ultimately shortchange students.
Can I add something to what Matt just said?
Sure.
Well, one of the really interesting things about the 4-day school week research is that in many rural communities, there's no difference. They're not always seeing in rural America that students are learning less. And one of the reasons is that they were already skipping Fridays for football games. And it wasn't just the football team, but it was like fan buses would be going out and they were missing Friday anyway. So it wasn't a big difference between the two.
That's a good transition into some of our questions from the audience, because our first one is for Bella. Jess Clark with Louisville Public Media says that Jefferson County Public Schools is really leaning hard into the summer programming and after school model. Can you talk a little bit more about what impact those programs have from your research in test scores, engagement, in comparison to extending the school day or year? And I'll also add on to that, are there any benefits or findings that you have about the ones that are incorporating these potentially non-academic but sports related or things like that to encourage kids to come?
Yes. I think the most important thing when we talk about like which ones are more effective is sort of what we've been saying is it's really the quality of the program is going to be core of all of this. So a really well-run summer program that focuses on an adequate amount of academic instructional time. And there is research that sort of shows what is that adequate amount of time. And I'm happy to send follow-up research and resources on that. But a really well-run summer program that does everything it's supposed to be doing is probably going to be more effective than a poorly run extended day program. Especially if we're talking about a school district that maybe they added 30 minutes onto their day, but they added it across the entire school day. So every class just got 5 minutes longer. That's probably not going to have any impact on students compared to sort of a really well-run after-school program or summer program. And so I think that's sort of key to all of it. The other thing that I think when we talk about sort of being able to compare the impacts of these programs is the attendance piece. And like you said, Sarah, like getting kids to actually show up. There is a lot of research in after school and summer programs that shows that they not only sort of improve attendance in sort of the after school space, but they also improve attendance during the school day. And so in a lot of regards, if students are more likely to show up to those after school programs where they're maybe more engaged or they're doing something that's a little bit different, that could be more effective than having a great program that nobody shows up to during the school day. And so I think that's also key to sort of all of this. And then the last thing I'll say, just on being able to compare, is it's super tricky to compare sort of outcomes from summer and after school programs because they vary so widely. They're not all focused on academic outcomes. Some of them don't touch on academics at all. And so you couldn't really compare what like the academic outcomes of those programs compared to sort of extending the school day or the school year. And so there are different sort of outcomes that come out of that. I do know that there are some research studies, and I want to say that Matt's paper, one of Matt's papers, has looked into sort of comparing sort of the outcomes or the efficacy of these different programs and which ones sort of boost academic outcomes more so than others. But I would just say, like, generally there are positive effects on academic outcomes that come out of all of them. It really depends on sort of how that time is used, and sort of the quality of that instruction is going to really determine the outcomes.
And Matthew's research reports, as well as some other things, are going to be posted. Some are posted in the chat now and will be incorporated into it afterwards. So if you want to dig into the research more, that will be up. I have a question, which I think will be for Jill, though feel free to jump in. They've seen some polling along with anecdotal evidence that most parents think their kids are at grade level and they aren't worried about learning loss, and they aren't worried about how much time the kids are spending in classes. What do we know about how kids communicate with parents about why they need to get their kid into extra programs in school or have an extended day or year?
I'm not familiar with the polls exactly that you're referring to. Maybe you know about them, Sarah. But what I do know is there was a big study done on summer programs from the summer of 2022, where 8 large districts around the country were using their federal pandemic recovery money and building out these big summer programs. And it was really hard to convince families to attend them. And one of the predispositions was not to tell families that your kids need to go to summer school because they're really behind. And instead, they were emphasizing how fun the summer program was. And this would be great enrichment for your kid. And in many of these school districts, they had far less than 10% of the families attend the program. Only one of the districts got a high turnout. The high turnout was 23%. And the reason why they got it is because they had a full day summer program from 8 a.m. to 5:30. So it doubled as free childcare for families. And they got a lot of families to attend. But then they ran out of their federal pandemic recovery money and they couldn't do the long hours again the next summer in 2023. And then when you looked at the evidence from this was a really well done study from scholars at Harvard and I think American Institute for Research. You had tiny, minuscule recovery in math, about 2 to 3%. So if a child was behind 100 days in learning, it means they caught up about 2 days, and 0 catch up in reading. It was nothing. And one of the problems is that the summer programs were short. They were only about 4 or 5 weeks. And there were a lot of no-shows. The students on average only showed up about like 10 to 14 days of it.
That's definitely something I've seen, and something that reporters should be looking out for when you are looking at an intervention report or looking at a program that your district has put into place, figuring out what the actual participation rate is, whether that program is an opt-in program where parents volunteer to send their kids, or if they're really targeting specific kids and trying to get them in. That can make a huge difference between how much they actually get out of that program. And is also really important to look at when you are trying to figure out the cost effectiveness of something that your district is working on. Dr. Kraft, could you comment a little bit about the after school research? And then I'd like to go into anything that any of you guys are seeing that needs more coverage, or common mistakes you're seeing reporters make when looking into this coverage.
The research on after school programming, particularly during the summer, I think is encouraging in that there are evidence of programs that have positive effects on students' academic achievement. But I think there's some real structural challenges to doing that at a high level of implementation at scale. And the reason is, for some of the things we've already highlighted, getting parents to opt into that is challenging. And even when they do, most summer school programs suffer from low rates of attendance. And so you get a small amount of families opting in. They may not be the families that you would ideally want to target necessarily. And even when they do, they're not there for the full amount of days that you would want. And it's difficult to coordinate that instruction with the instruction that's happening during the academic year. I think that a potential
positive development we've seen in a number of schools that have attempted to extend the school day, but have not been able to do that kind of formally, is to essentially treat after school programming that's physically at the school that happens immediately after the end of the traditional school day is kind of a de facto extension where it's not mandated, but it's really easy. Parents don't have to come and move their kid to another place. They just continue with it. And it's kind of part of the DNA of our schooling system. Those types of things exist, but they're often just kind of childcare with homework help. And if we can transition some of those programs to offering dedicated academic instruction where we have a higher degree of attendance, and we're able to take advantage of, as some districts have had, teachers who are willing to work in those programs or paraprofessionals for a stipend or additional hourly pay to effectively extend school without having to push up against some of the kind of large structural challenges of renegotiating contracts or obliging all parents. If you ever go with a coalition of the willing, but you keep that cultural rigor of it feels like school at the school building, that might be a reasonable compromise.
We've only got a couple minutes left, so I'd like Jill and Bella, if you give me one or two areas that you really think reporters need to be paying more attention, and Matt, you after they go through. Bella, do you want to start?
Sure. I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is really like before we even start talking about should we be adding more time, should we be lengthening the school year, should we be lengthening the school day, I think we really need to first, and this has been brought up already, but I think we really need to first evaluate how the time is already being used during the normal school day. And if that time is not being used effectively during the school day, adding more of the same that wasn't working before, probably not the right move. It's probably not going to have much of an impact. And so I think first really evaluating sort of how the school, the district organizes its regular school time and what is actually being done, if that's being used effectively, is the first thing to look at before we even talk about should we be adding more time.
And for reporters, that can be a little difficult to dig out of your individual districts, but you can sometimes find daily schedules on individual school websites. Sometimes it might be helpful to call teachers and ask them what the typical time is to get kids in and out of the class. It can be a little difficult if you're not doing a full research audit. Jill.
Well, I am a reporter, so I don't really have any advice. I think everyone's doing a great job.
And Matt?
I think I would always start a story with a school and a district by asking, hey, how many days are in your academic year? How long is the typical school day in your elementary, middle, and high school settings? And how many of those days that are actually officially counted are kind of half days where there's parent-teacher conferences for half of it, or are field trips, and just get a sense kind of what it all adds up to. That's something that should be reasonably accessible. And with some of the statistics in the working paper we have, you can easily kind of put in perspective a given school or district to the overall national distribution. What the
I think we might have lost him. And at any rate, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests, Matt, Jill, and Bella, for joining us. And I'd like to thank you all for attending and joining in our conversation. EWA members, please remember to fill out that evaluation survey. And we'd love to stay in touch. fill out our sign up for the EWA Today newsletter if you haven't already done so, and you'll be the first to hear about the next discussion. Thank you so much.